despite the weather. There are some seats up front. We have an intimate crowd, so if you want to move up, so you can really hear and soak in the conversation that's happening. I would like to thank my colleagues at MOCAD, Public Programming Team, Michigan State University Science Gallery Detroit, Community Foundation of Southeast Michigan, MSU Federal Credit Union, and Ford Foundation for supporting the Intersection Series. The Intersection Series is designed to bring together artists, scholars, and practitioners who are pushing the boundaries between the fields of science and art, and learn how these interdisciplinary approaches are thinking about problem solving and helping address a lot of the world's issues today. Today, Intersection is looking at the science of place, which is one of two programs aligned with the exhibition that just opened, Parallels and Peripheries, which is looking at artists who work at the intersection of art, technology, and the sciences. The exhibition has 12 artists, 10 are women. Over 50% of the artists have relationships to the Midwest, so they either were born here, live here, or work here, or went to school here. So the first iteration of this conversation, we wanted to bring together scholars, designers, artists. I mean, you name it, these amazing folks do it. And it's been great to talk to them as a lead up to this conversation. And examine the notion of place through the lens of art, science, and technology, and explore how artists and scientists might work together to create solutions. So I'll give a brief description for all our panelists, and then I'll turn it over to them so you can experience what's going to be a great conversation. Because based on our previous phone conversations, I got excited. So I'm really looking forward to this. So I'll start off with Cezanne on my far left. Cezanne's practice and research focuses on the intersection of design, technology, urbanism, social justice, and public policy for future making. She's interested in creating experiences, environments, and objects that increase engagement and participation. Cezanne is a non-profit executive, designer, curator, researcher, also the director of creative industries for Creative Many Michigan. Then we have Zach. Zach is an artist, educator, scholar, music producer, currently assistant professor of graphic design and experience architecture in the Department of Art History and Design at Michigan State University. Much of his work is spent in the pursuit of interrogating the preferred situations manifest in the design world in which we live, asking for whom, of what these situations are preferred and why. Sounds very scholastic to me, but when he breaks it down, it makes sense. And then we have John, whose practice and research focuses on discipline agnostic, collaborative approach to designing and making that recognizes the boundaries of the problems being addressed, not the artificial boundaries of traditionally defined disciplinary practices. John's creative and scholarly interests include digital fabrication, tangible user interface, design methods, problem-based learning, and communication between cross-disciplinary design teams. John and Cezanne work as a collaborative duo, rootoftwo, which is an award-winning hybrid design studio currently based in metropolitan Detroit. They make hybrid design projects, social objects, experiences, and works for the public realm, typically at the scale of devices, furniture, small buildings, and master plans. You'll see some of those images cycling through. I will shut up and turn it over to you guys.
Promotional tech discourses, such as those emanating from Silicon Valley. And so part of my aim is to sort of critique that and suggest maybe that not only are those things very material, but those materials have certain effects on us and each other. John?
So I guess what the effect of place on technology, right? And what's the interrelationship between those two things? How do they inform one another? How do you deal with things when you're, we have this sort of illusion of this like global system, the internet, the World Wide Web. but how does that manifest in place, and how do we design for that? How do we consider, who our work is for? How do we engage with it? How do we make it inclusive? How do we tackle issues? So I think that's sort of the raft of questions that we'll be asked to address today. So we'll talk about it, in the abstract, in the academic, and in the specific, I suppose, by talking about specific projects that we've done undertaken. So, do you want to start with the question?
Well, yeah, I was going to ask, maybe in that spirit, if there's a particular project that you feel like you've done that speaks to like that question of either the material location or the distributed material location of various technologies, or the distributed locations of the people that you're talking to, like, or your audiences. Are there particular projects that you guys worked on that you feel like, oh yeah, like that,
Sure. So I think the first one that I think of is our Wither Veins project, because it sort of exists at multiple scales, and it's very easy to read the project as a public art project that has a similar sort of iconic form in whatever geographical place it takes. But it really is a project that relies on localization, and not just localization of both news and geography, but really of the people and the kind of specific issues that they're tackling. So in this project, it's essentially a 4.5 foot tall chicken. You're probably going to see some 4.5 foot tall headless chickens rotating. And when we first did this, when we first started thinking about this, it was in 2010, and the sort of jumping off point was this idea of exploring Detroit's kind of both industrial and kind of agrarian heritage, and really wanting to think about how do you sort of reclaim kind of technological devices of previous ages. And so for us, we really hit on the idea of the weather vane. And if you ever go to the Henry Ford Museum, they have like this really deep collection of weather vanes that you can go and do a lot of study on. But equally, we kind of wondered what was the weather of today. And when we started thinking about that, we started thinking about social media. We started thinking about the way that social media sort of propels both connection, and it had this kind of promise of connection and connectivity, but also we were already beginning to see the very troubling currents of what happens when you so localize information that you split people into information ghettos, and you begin kind of sorting people based on that. And then you sort of amplify that by putting them in these kind of echo chambers of their work. And so what Wither Veins actually does is it's a system that sort of feeds in kind of news feeds from Twitter, but then it's actually localized by keyword search that have been derived through public workshops with people in those places. And so when we finally did the project in Folkestone, it was before, it was 2014, it was in an area of England that is right where the Channel Tunnel crosses with France. So it is the epicenter of what became Brexit. It was the first place in the UK that actually voted a UK independence member of parliament to the EU. And so already there was this conversation between what was happening with the immigrants who were coming over and making place and making home, and what their fears and concerns were, versus the people that were sort of long-term working class residents in Folkestone, revealing, then amplified by the fact that it's got an international triennial that is looking at sort of creative placemaking writ large, but then also how they're attracting sort of Londoners to the Green Belt, right? So it's like a perfect storm of all of those issues to sort of look at. And so that was one of those things where, as we thought about how you read a city through sort of these iconic elements, we really started breaking down place into an object that eventually would become kind of iconic. And then we played with other things like cutting off France's national symbol in a chicken. So.
Wow. It's funny, I was thinking about, when you were talking just now, I was thinking about the interweaving of the digital and the city together, and the way that manifests oftentimes in discourses around like the smart city. And I think that to bring it back to Detroit, that's something that I've been curious in talking to people about, particularly over the summer at Science Gallery. or at Science Gather's inaugural exhibition, Hustle, I worked on a project that dealt with machine learning and the prediction of the future, and it kind of intended to pose the question about like who gets to say what the future is going to be like, and what are the politics of that kind of prediction. And I think that when the physical and the digital, well, I mean, meat space and cyberspace get woven together within the city, those power dynamics and the way that our interactions are shaped take on sort of a new tenor because it's so deeply connected with everyday life. But John, I'm curious too, in terms of like your work in like tangible interfaces and other sort of connected products and services, is like, have you guys been approached about like doing smart city stuff, and what's your response?
With any project, you've got to really look at, what is the ethics, what is the morality of that. Technology is not neutral. It's not, it's never just like instrumentalization. It's, there's always values baked in, there's biases, there are points of view, the coming algorithmic apocalypse, I go straight to dystopian hellscape. I mean, that's
Me too.
that's my thing. But the thing is thinking about, what are the really motivations? What's really being asked for? Because there's a sort of like sense that we can use art, we can use technology, we can use culture as a panacea to solve all the world's ills. And that's just frankly not true. But the thing is, what is the opportunity that's being put in front of you? So, one of the issues, to go back to Folkestone, was the fact that, Folkestone is actually experiencing a 21st century bypass kind of experience, because they built the high-speed rail network from London, from where the Channel Tunnel comes out to London. And so there's this massive property crisis, there's, huge social ills, it's a teenage pregnancy capital of Europe, there's a huge drug problem, so you have all these things, and you have someone who made their money in insurance who's buying up all the abandoned property in the town and putting that in a trust. And so, so you question, is this just gentrification? Are we here basically as the shock troops of gentrification? And you've got to weigh up, what is actually going on. And so in talking to people and meeting with people, you find that, it's a very wealthy man, an individual who's buying up as buildings become abandoned, but they are being put in trust. So it's not about turning a quick profit, it's about how to stabilise that town. So at that point, it's, you made the judgment call of, this is something that we can get on board with. We're not going to ignore it, we're going to point the finger at that as much as we are anything else. But at the same time, you don't go in, like la la la, this is all unicorns and rainbows. You got to pay attention to who lives there, who's invited, and how open things are to that. And try and push on that as much as you possibly can.
I'll definitely add to that too, because in any place that you're doing this work, you're having to think about like what are the sort of both background analytics and evidence that exist on the ground. So, we have started a long-term research project called Any Space, whatever, period. We play with language a lot. And in that, we're really trying to, and it's a first project that we're doing that's really looking at the very specific condition of sort of a technological smart city future of Detroit. And it's a first for us, it's certainly not a first anywhere, but there was a sort of confluence of the background understanding that Detroit has 35% of households that are without connection to the internet. It also has a number of households that are without sort of even a computer, and even if we think of our smartphones as computers, that's like the analytics there. And yet, when we think about the digital divide, or when we sort of have those conversations about the advancing smart city, we only ever imagine it as utopias. We only ever imagine it as this thing that is part of our progressivist, positivist, national myth making. And so with this project, we're trying to actually create a space where nobody can use technology in it as a way of like leveling the playing field, to then have a prompt and conversations about what kind of technological future do we want to build together? How do we bring the most people along as we're building that? What are the right technologies to be deployed? And so I sort of think about how that becomes a way of sort of community building around this, and it's a way of deconstructing who's classically thought of as an expert in this space. Because I also think the construction of expertise is something that we sort of hide behind in terms of technology, right? And it's one of the sort of last bastions of the but we know better because we're experts. And people's lived experience is the expertise you really need when you're talking about the fact that this wholesale idea of the public internet as a public good also often comes with the trade-off of the selling of the data and the sort of giving data away writ large as a city. And if you're a city who's not prepared to have those conversations about what we withhold or whether or not we're putting our smart city data in a trust, like you're leaving yourselves open to the very big dominant players in smart city infrastructure, which means you have Intel designing your cities. It means you have like IBM designing your cities. It means you have Alphabet and Google designing your cities. And so far their track record for designing cities for people is not awesome. So.
Reminds me of last night as I was freaking out about this, because I get like super nervous before I do this kind of stuff. Last night I was freaking out about this. I was reading back through David Harvey's terrific article from New Left Review in 2008 called The Right to the City. And in it, he talks about how the whole history of urbanization is also a history of capital needing spaces for surplus to be absorbed. And so thinking about like massive public urbanization or urban renewal projects beginning with Paris in the 1850s, extending to New York with Robert Moses. And one of the things that continues to surprise me is the way that language is sort of weaponized in order to promote the idea that whether it's the smart city or whether it's I don't know, mixed use development or whatever the thing is, that these are all sort of code words for spaces where surplus can be absorbed for organizations that are consistently seeking profit, right? And so I was thinking about that in the context of the work I did in Malawi, actually, over the summer. I worked with a brilliant agriculture researcher named Stephanie White, who is just amazing, and she was like the PI on the project, and I was totally her little minion. She's like amazing and awesome, and the work that we're doing there is basically kind of like what you're thinking about in Detroit, about asking who gets to talk about what they want their future to look like, and what kind of technologies do they imagine, and who influences that technological imaginary. And so we began a series of workshops over the summer in Malawi to talk about the urban food system there, and looking at the centralization and the ongoing discourses of development that are kind of foisted upon certain communities that have certain ideological thrusts and also certain technological imperatives behind them. And so there's some images from the workshop that we had with people who work in what tend to be called informal markets. But informal is kind of a derogatory term in development discourses. And so one of the things that we've been trying to do even is like talk about them as people's markets as opposed to informal markets. And a lot of times it goes back to this idea of like, laying claim to a place and who has the opportunity to do that, particularly in technologically infused spaces. So really thinking about that.
One of the words that you have identified in some of the questions that as we were exchanging before this was speculation. And so that takes me to sort of like futures, like the financial speculation, but also takes me to like sort of speculative design. And so design fiction and critical design and speculative design and all this, like, exploration of these liminal spaces and trying to reveal, the idea of design. And I just wonder, maybe how does that impact on, who gets to speculate and, what is the nature of that speculation?
Well, real quick, I want you to jump in. But I was thinking about the Naughty Objects conference at MIT in like 2015, and that was like when Ahmed Ansari produced that sort of biting critique of Dunn and Raby's work. So speculative design has this whole history of emerging from the academy, of which I think all of us the three of us are beneficiaries. So that tends to be a really, like, those kinds of practices, and I think we've even talked about this, are a really restrictive space. And so, yeah, like, how do we democratize envisioning the future without that democratization somehow also being, like, influenced by those who have control over the sort of hegemonic discourses about what the future looks like in the first place, like the Google Home commercial, right? Like Google Home has this commercial that comes out, 2 years ago or whenever it first came out. The product wasn't even out yet, where it's like when Amazon files a patent for a floating warehouse, that's science fiction. And because they can afford to file a patent, all of a sudden they're the ones that have control over what the future looks like. And so, like, for you to establish the space where nobody has to say, like, let's talk about the future. Brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of classically show a slide of the Jetsons because, a lot of people in the U.S. sort of get down with that. And you sort of think the feat in that is the design of the flying car, right? That's the thing that most of us sort of, like, remember. But this is why I always use it as a cautionary slide, because it's a perfect representative of the under-imagined future. Right? We could imagine the flying car, but we couldn't imagine Jane working. We could imagine the flying car, but we couldn't imagine the idea that they would do anything other than work in a factory. We could imagine the flying car, and yet we had a very domestic robot that is highly problematic, right? And so this idea of who gets to sort of write people into a future is one of those things that, like, often starts at the basic level of our work. And so we sort of moved away from the idea of sort of speculative design to really sort of think about anticipation, because one of the things, if you are talking about having, and probably the reason why I come at this from like a science and tech public policy point of view too, is because you do have government and you can't afford to set aside sort of democracy writ large, right? So somebody has to be in the business of anticipating future selves. Somebody has to be in the business of sort of designing sort of regulation that isn't always behind corporations, but sort of begins to anticipate where things are heading so that they can sort of work for the common good. But it requires a kind of political system that is able to be sort of radically reimagined in the sense that it can function independent of sort of the way that we've kind of constructed capital. Which isn't sort of to say that you can displace all capitalism, or that this is an apology for a kind of just Marxist reality, but it is a sort of plea to say that if we're going to have a third sector and a third space, then they also have to be able to think and talk about the technological future. And in order to do that, they have to sort of get in bed with doing the anticipatory work. But I think the reason why I like anticipation better than speculation is because anticipation means you have to have some sense of where you've been, some sense of where you are, and then some sense of where you want to go and who you want to bring with you. And so for me, it's just a little bit better shift to sort of live in that space than to sort of fully live in the like wild speculative dream space.
And I think the potential dark side of anticipation is algorithms, the predictive analytics, where the decisions are being made by non-human entities. And so, again, this is me going to the dystopian hellscape. But the thing is that, we've seen that so far the biases that are being baked into the algorithms, unintentionally, but only when you can't recognize a non-Caucasian person as a human being, that's a problem. And this is happening, and so go back to Rittel and Weber, wicked problems 1973, and the thing is, the last sort of criteria of wicked problem is you don't have the right to be wrong, and the thing is, if you bring a diverse group of people together into the room to talk about how you frame the problem, what the problems are, how you tackle these things, how you find a way forward, I think you're more likely to bake in knowledge of your biases and understanding of what alternatives might be. Whereas if you deploy an algorithm and use the Silicon Valley sort of we'll run perpetual beta and we'll fix it when it was wrong. There's some of the unintended consequences of some of these things. The implications are just huge. So fixing it once, and fix it in post, is untenable.
I can't help but ask maybe something related to anticipation, which is the concept, and I think it has to do quite a bit with place, and we hear about it pretty frequently, is the idea of resilience. And I've been wrestling with this because the grants that I have been associated with to travel to Malawi to do the work that we've been doing have often mentioned the idea of resilience in food systems. And I was just reading this article by Orit Halpern, who is a great sort of media theorist, and she talked about the idea of resilience as sort of normalizing or naturalizing a state of crisis that allows or that keeps us from imagining some sort of alternative possibility, because we're kind of always responding to something, which tends to be some kind of disaster. And she connects resilience with algorithmic anticipation through this idea of speculation and hedging. And so she talks about mines as a space of speculation and hedging, and also mines now using predictive analytics in order to figure out how best to ameliorate their effects on the environment. And my brain was totally melted when I read that. And so there's another piece in here somewhere about the mines from which the minerals for our mobile devices come from. And I did this piece with a couple friends, and it's like an object, and it's a 3D model of the region of the Congo from which the tantalum for the capacitors in your phone comes. And when you approach it, the more phones that are within a certain radius of the object, the more the object begins to shake, and it actually sifts the landscape through kind of like a cheese grater type thing into the bottom of this clear container. When I read Halpern's article, I couldn't help but think oh, well that piece is first of all of a sudden I was oh man, that's less interesting than I thought it was when I made it. And then also how do I sort of grapple with resilience maybe being a really good thing in certain situations, but also having this politics to it, that I don't know how to think it.
So I think for me, because I also do one of those jobs where I have to write the word resilience about 1 million times a day in grant applications. And in that sense, I think about the way that it also serves to sort of fetishize sort of the labor of traumatized people and places. And also the way that when it's used for good, it asks us to think about building systems that have redundancy in them so that we can weather future shocks. And I think that the acknowledgement that we sort of live in these sort of volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous times, and none of us know when there's going to be this return to certainty, but we're all going to try and fool ourselves that we stand on solid ground. And I think that that's where it comes from. And so when I'm mindful about that that's where that word comes from, then it asks me to sort of pick and choose the battles where I understand my complicitness, right? So the idea that I have a cell phone means I'm complicit in the sort of conflict minerals trade. The degree to, and so then I have to be conscious of how often I replace it. As a designer, it means that I have to choose whether or not I participate in sort of the mass industrialization of what my field is. And then I have identity issues because I'm like, can I really call myself a designer if I'm not making products that like scale? And then it sort of further asks me to sort of think about if those are all the benefits I enjoy of sort of participating in this resilience economy, then what are all the people who are sort of at the sort of margins of that economy, and how well have we really designed it for them to weather future shocks? And I think that that is the sort of like real grist of all the work. None of it has easy solutions, none of it has easy answers. I think we sort of keep dealing with the conflict more so than being able to sort of feel ever good about how great it was that we put a work out there in the world that kind of points at it. I've called it two things. One is the Victorian hands, right? So artists and designers are sort of left in this position where they can do that about social issues and problems. It's like the Victorian hands guy. And then the other side of it is like, how do we actually show up in policy spaces to make those changes? Because some of it we can do at a human-to-human level, some of it we can take charge of ourselves, but a lot of it, unfortunately, is still in the hands, at scale, in government and in capital. And how we participate in those quite often show up in our everyday behavior and our everyday voting.
I mean, everyday voting, I'll pick up from there, is, every time you swipe your bank card, you're essentially voting. You're voting for what you want your president to be. For an example, I used to work in product development. I worked for even for baby products, right? Wholesome families, producing straws and bottles and all this kind of stuff. It was a highly contested space because in the industrialized West, people are having fewer children. So if you want to grow your market share, you're basically going to take someone else's product off the shelf, right? So you've got this highly competitive system, and cost really matters. People love cheap products. So one of the things that I realised when I was working there was, everything was being offshored to be manufactured in China. And the thing is, baby strollers, the tires are made of EVA, and EVA is illegal to manufacture in Western Europe or North America. It's essentially cancer in a bucket. It's basically a two-part resin that you mix and it foams, but the thing is, it's perfectly acceptable to have someone with no personal protective equipment, basically mix this stuff in a bucket and pour it into a mold in China. So part of the business model of the company I was working for was giving Chinese people cancer, right? And so part of the cost of having the products that we have is, might be low cost to us, but it's high cost to somebody else in that supply chain. And so having an awareness of what present are we voting for by where we put our dollars and cents is something that I think we have to really pay attention to.
Should we put on teacher hats and ask what the role of education is in this?
Why don't I ask the question, since I'm the only one who refuses to teach at all. I have nothing to teach here. So for the people who are responsible for molding young minds, in terms of the next generation, seriously, like, in terms of where design education has, and I would also sort of expand this to the new sort of jurisdictional claim that both design and technology has. How do you sort of help students sort of grapple with both the power and privilege of the work that they're being asked to do, but also instill in them a sort of sense of values and ethics in terms of how they're doing the work?
So I run a fairly new graduate program at the University of Michigan. We were in a fortunate position of being able to start from scratch. We didn't have a graduate program, so basically we got to reinvent. We got to design a program that's fit for purpose for the 21st century. And the most critical components, the skills that we are looking for in our students are emotional intelligence and humility. You know, I mean, those are the key skills, because if you're going to set yourself up to work on social wicked problems, which is what we've done, is, you know, you need to be able to listen, you need to be able to have respect, and you need to be able to, you know, enter, engage with, and exit, you know, with grace, with the communities that you're working with. So it's a different, it's a different model, and it takes a different kind of person to be able to do that. And frankly, I mean, the hard skills that you know, many graduate programs teach, you know, we sort of take those for granted, and we're actually looking for the soft skills that are going to make people who are fit for purpose to make a difference.
I think this is something that has been occupying an increasing proportion of my brain lately. I teach in 2 programs at Michigan State. I teach in the graphic design program, so we have a BFA in graphic design. We also have a graduate program as well that we redesigned. I've been really trying to grapple with this in undergrad education. I also teach in, we have the Experience Architecture degree program, which is basically our UX degree. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is find ways to, both those degrees are pre-professional, so it is, to me, unethical to teach in a way that I'm not giving my students skills that they're going to leave with and be able to get jobs. Like, regardless of my politics and regardless of my sort of frustrations with the way things are right now, it would be a disservice to them to not give them the opportunity to develop the skills they need for their careers. On the other hand, I think it's important to find ways to privilege a critical outlook on technology and the interfaces, particularly for which my students will be designing things, while at the same time giving them those skills. So the question for me has been how to sort of create projects that open spaces for research and critique, while at the same time catering the details of those projects in a way that forces students to make some of the things that they might end up making in the future. To me, that's like a really difficult conversation that I've been sort of having with my colleagues and with myself, but I think we talked about this on the phone actually, when we sort of did our initial call with Larry, is the connection between design and the visual arts and like science and technology studies and the history of science and like looking at the political economy and the sort of techno-scientific milieu from which all of the things that our students make emerge. And without understanding that, I don't think we can cultivate sort of ethical practitioners. So that's been definitely my goal, is to sort of contextualize the kinds of things that my students end up making in the sort of broader socio-political historical context.
So I guess the one sort of challenging question or comeback that I have, because, you know, where I enter this through the work that I do at Creative Mini is really thinking about kind of the creative economy, and that sort of leads to like thinking about future of work, and that leads back to this idea that sort of the next wave of sort of automation and digitization and where we're heading with artificial intelligence is actually going to displace about 40% of workers. So when you think about educating for the future of work, I think that is one of those spaces where education probably is on the front line of sort of having to rapidly shift out of the way that we educated people for very specific jobs to sort of having to shift to thinking about designing the jobs of the future. And I sort of liken it to this idea that people talk about, people like to sort of, this is where I go to the apocalyptic hellscape. It's like people like to sort of think this next technological revolution is going to be just like the printing press, right? Well, we're going to imagine that all these jobs are going to flow forth and we just don't know what they are, but it's totally going to be fine. But when you actually really unpack how challenging that period was to the authority of the church, to the authority of city-state, to the authority of kings, that was massive. And it was not easy. And so the idea that somehow we'll be fine sort of forgets the real sort of hard period of that shift and who got left out and who gained and who benefited. And it wasn't fully optimistic. So again, I think I would ask, like, there is this, I know from education, short-termism pressure by parents and others to make the degree worthwhile, to make the degree pay, right? Especially because education is expensive as hell. But how do you really be honest with the idea that you just simply don't know what the jobs are of tomorrow in the work that you're doing with students?
My students are in the audience right now, and I think that they can vouch for the fact that I've told them on no uncertain terms that things will be difficult for them in the future. In fact, I've made them read things. I think I've told them that things will be challenging in the future. We've read things that make them fearful, I imagine. Yeah, well, to me, I don't know, I mean, maybe this goes back to my interest in history, but I think that if we look at the trajectory and the ideologies embedded within the kinds of technologies that we work with, for example, looking at contemporary computing and the way that it connects with things like game theory, which sort of assume humans to be sort of rational actors, not interested in altruism in any way whatsoever, what kind of technologies emerge from that attitude? Well, we've seen the results of it. We've seen the results of it, and so like that to me suggests that technology and political economy are connected, and if we're really going to have jobs, or if we even want to have jobs, maybe we don't have jobs, I don't know what they look like, but the part of my point when I talk to students about this is actually that you as a student need to make a decision about the degree to which you want to buy into, or in some way decide how to resist the tendencies that are inherent in the technologies that we use and that shape our kind of ideas about what our world is like in the first place.
Should we get some questions?
Are there any burning questions? Okay, Rasul.
Thank you, all of you. So you had a great, the general degree shirt.
Large way, but like if you think about wither veins in particular, that's been a project that sort of got incubated in like 2010 that then had to get sort of partially fundraised for to sort of get some of the ideas off the paper, and then it had to get commissioned, and then it had to get executed, and then it had to be rethought again for sort of new context, and then ultimately started thinking about, so how do we sort of open source this so that it's in a kit and can be used in a lot of different ways. And so what that ends up looking like is that you sort of noodle on a project and noodle on an issue for a lot longer period, but it also means that I like to say that I was really good at the marshmallow test as a kid. Like, I can do deferred gratification. And I think that that's something that's different about sort of some science and technology work, is that in order to really sort of mine both the storytelling and the narrative qualities of some of it, and to also really think about how you unpack it for people so that you're not sort of leading with the tech and the wow of the how. It means that we just take much longer in our work. So this idea that you can just sort of pump new work out there is something that requires us to work differently, but it also requires us to show up differently as artists and designers and place in community. And so, we tend to fully fundraise for our works through like research and development in phases before it ever gets to the public. So like Any Space Whatever, we've been kind of working on that for almost 3 years. It started off as a project that we did for Center for Land Use Interpretation called Bug Out Location Tactical Shelter. And it was very much looking at still this idea of the fact that like all of these kind of tech billionaires have all of their resilience systems in place so that they know where they're going when the apocalypse happens. They know where they're going when the internet collapses. And the rest of us don't, right? We don't have our shelters. We don't have our places to go. And so we were playing with this kind of militarized kind of landscape that sort of got us into this rabbit hole of then looking at the fact that they have air gap structures and what that looks like in terms of architecture. And then we started looking at, well, what does that mean when you sort of bring that back to a place like Detroit that doesn't have an internet to begin with, that's a public utility or a public good. And so it's through like all of those like iterations and questions and contemplations that means that this like work, by the time it shows up in a public way or in a public space, is going to be at least another 10-year project. But we sort of have one-liners, these things that are sort of afterthoughts that we kind of just try and pump out there and put out there too. And I think having to work in that different way has meant, to some extent, not participating fully in what we think of as a contemporary art world, which has a different logic and a different demand. And I think that's why this idea that we are intentionally research-based is slightly different.
Is that okay if I jump in on that question?
Yeah.
So super quick, or maybe not super quick. The question of resilience and how it plays into the relationship between art, science, and technology in my own work is a really good one. And I don't know exactly how all of these things connect, but there are kind of 2 projects in particular. One of which is very much in its early stages. I would say that I am kind of like a reformed designer or reformed ad agency guy. I used to do like UX and like advertising. And so I'm nominally a teacher of design, but I would say most of the things I make, I don't know where they fit, and I just try to do whatever the thing is that feels right for the thing I'm trying to do. So I'm working with a group of researchers from the agriculture school right now on a project on resilient food systems in Lansing, in the Lansing area. And one of the things that we're grappling with on that project is like how to frame the idea of resilience. I was referred to in the grant application as the resilience provocateur. Basically meaning that, I'm going to be there to sort of like push back on some people's ideas about what it means, because there's like a lot of, so anyway, I'm kind of interested in that, but there's another project that is also in its nascent stages about the way that the technical imaginary of what the future of food systems is like is shaped by certain organizations and institutions and not by others. So it's going to be sort of a long-term research project that looks at all the discourses in the history of popular technology magazines like Wired, MIT Tech Review, Popular Science, and looks at advertising and articles about the future of food across those, and then compares them to like international development documents from like USAID and other NGOs, as well as policy documents from other countries, to see like kind of how the imaginary of resilient food systems has been shaped by the sort of Western capitalist tech world.
Hi. So I think that there is a huge disconnect between artists, cultural practitioners, scientists, let's say, and corporate decision makers in different ways. And I'm saying this from the lens of like whether it's climate change awareness or marijuana legalization, like the bridge between that and what speaks to the corporate decision makers is, oh, I can make money off of this, right? And so referring to what you were talking about in terms of the algorithmic apocalypse, something that I think about a lot. And so far I haven't seen anything where it's like, there's that bridge where it's like, okay, maybe instead of making money off of taking our data or putting us in cages, there's an alternative. Do you think it's the role of the artist to figure out what that bridge is, or is it just the role to continue to produce content that might inspire someone else to create that bridge?
Depends who those artists are. Depends who's playing that part. I think if you're within a system, it's like that event horizon that you can't see beyond that point. And it's like any oppressive system, basically formulates and turns back on yourself. So the thing is, if you're completely within that system and you're benefiting from that system, I don't think that you're going to see outside of the system. So the marginal, the disenfranchised is actually where I think the solutions are going to come from. It's going to be people who can see clearly what that system is, that have the ability to critique and come up with alternatives. So that's part of what educationally I'm trying to do, is to provide the opportunity and the space for designers to think beyond the systems that have been set before them. And so the thing is if we leave it up to Google and Amazon and Intel and all the rest of the companies, to basically to regulate themselves, then we're going straight to hell. Then it's got to come from someone else.
And I'll just kind of piggyback on that really quickly, because I think part of the way that a system acts is it tries to convince you there are no alternatives. That by the time you've sort of reached that point where you see the choice, it's as if it could only be one, right? So it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in that sense. And so, for instance, when we talk about the idea that the only way to sort of do safety in cities is through actual surveillance and actual image tracking and video tracking, that's one way. There's a lot of ways that you could look at sensing technology that still preserves the anonymity of the human face. But we made a choice, somebody made a choice somewhere along the line at the point where we just felt like we had to adopt cameras in our city, right? And so by the time it sort of got to us as a citizen, as a public, after it had been, veiled in a lot of techno speak and a lot of trust us, we're experts, right? That choice had already been taken from us. It was have cameras or have not explore the question of how do we do sensing in cities? What is the minimum technology that we need in order to sort of understand what would bring safety, as opposed to what would create a surveillance state? And because we don't have participatory citizens' assemblies that get that sort of diversity of perspectives and points of view, we sort of have surrendered kind of most democratic control to the people who are actually sort of buying these technologies wholesale and deploying them in cities wholesale. And I kind of can't fault decision makers. They're also not experts, right? So they get trapped in this idea that they're always looking for somebody who in theory knows better. And they're not listening to their own instincts, and there's no time to listen to instincts. And then when you add in money to that occasion, it is such a conflating factor that the way technology often shows up, it's a default choice. It's as if this is the only one that could have been invented. And so a lot of our work, I think, and I think the work of all artists, is trying to unpack that truth and sort of just say that the problem framing itself is what's the problem.
Hi, thank you for the discussion. One thing I wanted to get your opinion on is how we can expand the definition of technology. And it was a point that was actually brought up at the Critical Context Summit. So we often think of technology as only digital technology. We have new modalities of thinking, new ways of creating space and creating room for discussion can also be considered technology. And this idea of how do we get people to kind of not only look at technology as the digital. Sam Van Aken, who is an artist and was actually part of an earlier intersection discussion, he's been working a lot with grafting technology. And I was talking with him recently, and he was trying to get funding for this grafting technique that he figured out how to graft onto plants that are able to exist in the desert, so he can grow all kinds of food crops in places where you shouldn't really be able to, but he can't get funding because it's not new technology. Even though it's something that could change the lives of millions of people, no one wants to fund it because there's no digital component. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. I mean, we do a little bit in technology and well, my grad students, and I talk about language as a technology. And so, and I always tell the same story. I mean, it's like this is going back to The Origin of Consciousness and the Creation of the Bicameral Mind by Julian James, where he's looking at all these Assyrian phrases that are carved in stone, ancient Babylonia, and there's always the emperor has a little throne on his shoulder with a little person sitting in it. And the speculation is that this is the voice of God. When you're confronted with a problem, you hear the voice of God telling you how to act. And what it is it comes to a certain point where the emperor is prostrate on the ground because the throne is empty and God has gone. And this is contemporaneous with the development of the cuneiform writing, right? So people start pressing reeds into clay tablets. And that creates the need for you to be able to say I, because previously it was always obvious who was speaking because you were right there. It makes you have to conceive of time because you're now able to communicate across time. And what it is the loss of the God. I mean, what this is saying is that basically we have two brains. And in mythological time, what was going on was we literally had two separate brains. By creating writing, actually rewired the brain so that we now had access to the other side. And so what I would say is if writing with a reed in clay makes that level of shift, then what does the internet do to us? Like, what are we becoming? Like, what is our human becoming with the technological overlay that we've got? But, I mean, I take your point, and you know, I view language as a technology.
One thing I was just thinking about is how our kind of piggybacking on what John's saying, the concept of what technology is not a disinterested concept, meaning that there are certain, bodies, whether those are people or institutions or whatever, that have a particular interest in construing technology in a particular way such that they benefit from that construing, right? So to me, in many ways, to ask what technology is a political question. And that's sort of what I think about it.
And I'll take the opportunity to piggyback on this since I'm not moderating this one, as opposed to the Critical Context Summit where I couldn't give a kind of full answer. But for me, I think part of the issue is that, particularly kind of in the US context and frame, we sort of have adopted this linear understanding of sort of innovation, and so this idea that basic science is like the ultimate, and then technology is merely just the adaptation and scaling of those innovations. For a long time, that idea that if you were doing something that was using a very coded and loaded phrase, pioneering in science, because like the pioneers of science is like the sort of foundational text for how the national academies have constructed like our entire pipeline for like innovation culture. So it's like when you used to be able to claim that space, if you were doing gene editing, if you were doing grafting, if you were doing that, you had the highest claim. But what's happening is that erosion of expertise in terms of basic research and basic scientific funding from the federal level has over time sort of meant, because technology is already born to scale, because it already exists in capital, because corporations can already do an R&D, what you find is this erosion and sort of retreat into the academy of these ideas of science, which only serves to sort of make it even more ivory tower. And so this is where I think the work of people who are doing sort of appropriate technology and sort of citizen science and stuff that is actually of and in and with the field becomes all the more relevant. But the funding systems and the of mechanisms to support that and validate that, and sort of equate that, right, to sort of research and peer review are inequitable, right? And so it does produce that exact thing. It also matters where you do it, right? Because not every place forms its socio-technical imaginary the way that the US has. So in places where there is much more thought around participatory sort of citizen assemblies for that kind of scientific work, you see real grassroots innovation being embraced. And it makes me kind of sad. That's like where I get like super sad about the US, like, because it is no longer true that we are highest and best in any of this stuff. And it's not that that concept wasn't problematic to begin with, but we've certainly ceded that ground, and we don't necessarily have the apparatus in place to really make sure that we're weathering that going forward.
The question about the grafting, I think, is really interesting. I think the answer to get funding in some ways called art. Do you know, is he part of the Guerrilla Grafters group? Okay, the Guerrilla Grafters are like that. They've been able to do what they've done because they have framed their scientific interventions as artistic practice. And I think that goes back maybe to the question about like the relationship between the artist maybe as like a translator of value to like corporate America, maybe in some sense like the resistance or the conversation should be like, if art is whatever we say it is as artists, you know, media agnostic or, you know, whatever we construe it as, then like that scientific engagement, if it's not accepted by the sort of formal scientific community, you know, maybe it would be better framed as artistic practice. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
So with that, I think we'll conclude the conversation for now. I want to thank Cezanne,